That night of heavy rain, Ruth Ellery stood with her suitcase on the sidewalk, the word burden still ringing in her ear. Paul didn't shout. He spoke coldly, as if terminating a contract and turning away without room for reply. She tried to remember if she'd forgotten her blood pressure medication, then realized the bottle was in her coat pocket. Cars passed by, kicking up water, and no one stopped to understand why a 72-year-old woman was shivering at her doorstep. The sensation wasn't just cold, it was free fall, as if all the mother-son stories had been erased at once. Ruth considered asking her neighbor for shelter, but the closed curtain answered first. She held her suitcase tightly to keep from slipping, took a deep breath, and decided to walk to the bus stop. There was no plan. There was only the impulse to get out of there without begging for something that no longer existed. In the shelter of the stop, water dripped from the ceiling in 2 persistent drips, and the wind twisted the broken umbrella. She took a quick inventory. Old cell phone with 12% battery, ID, card, spare glasses, and her already soaked coat. She remembered a number she hadn't called in years. Vivian, the sister who always spoke less than she felt. The wet screen didn't respond to touch, but the name appeared. Simple, like a rope thrown from above. Ruth hesitated for 3 seconds, embarrassed that she needed it, and then pressed the green button. "I'm coming to get you," was all she heard, before the call dropped. She hugged her suitcase like someone holding onto a pole on a gale and waited. The wait lasted little longer than the fear, and that was enough to keep her from collapsing. Vivian arrived with her hazard lights on and a blanket in the back seat. There were no questions, just a quick, practical assessment. "Are you okay? Let's get out of the cold, and we'll talk later." In the cup holder was a hot tea that seemed made for that night, even though it wasn't. Ruth felt her hands slowly thaw, and with them came a mixture of anger and relief. In the rearview mirror, Vivian's eyes held the firmness of someone who decides first and talks later. They didn't look back at the house. They headed straight for the main avenue, without nostalgia, without needing a last look. The sound of the windshield wipers marked the rhythm of their next steps. It was an ordinary car, but at that moment, it was a concrete chance to start over. Their first destination was an apartment. Vivian kept empty, a silent plan that now made perfect sense. Ruth entered the bathroom, took off her wet clothes, turned on the hot water, and let her body know she was safe. In the steam of the shower, she cried silently. Not as someone suffering, but as someone releasing a burden. The large towel, clean pajamas, and the simple scent of soap gave her a sense of grounding. Vivian made soup and left a short note. "We'll sleep, and we'll get everything sorted tomorrow." Ruth ate slowly, as if rediscovering her own rhythm. Then she lay down, turned out the light, and felt the silence not as abandonment, but as space. The first night away from her son didn't hurt any less. It simply stopped hurting when alone. In the morning, Vivian set the table with coffee, fruit, and a notepad. The plan was clear: new phone, password change, bank alert, and meeting with lawyer Grace at 2 p.m. Everything would be documented, from messages to the physical condition of the bags, with photos, dates, and times. Ruth would sign a simple notarized statement of what happened to clear up any doubts early on. Vivian had already taken care of the basics: dry clothes, checked medications, and the doctor's contact information for a medical certificate if needed. No more going back to the house to get things. That would be mediated, safe, and with lists. Ruth listened to everything, and for the first time in a long time, didn't argue with herself. When she agreed, she realized she was taking charge, even though she still trembled inside. Grace arrived on time, briefcase in hand, with the calm of someone who separates emergencies from noise. She listened to the narrative from beginning to end, interrupting only to record dates, names, and locations. She explained the immediate measures: an extrajudicial notification to prevent movement, a protocol for protecting the elderly, and a request for protective custody. She spoke about keeping a record of incidents, not out of revenge, but to create legal backing against future manipulation. She established a single channel of contact with Paul and Marissa, all in writing, with no phone calls. She agreed that any attempts at emotional contact would be filed as evidence, not responded to in the heat of the moment. Ruth asked if she had done anything wrong. Grace replied that the mistake would be failing to document it. They left with a clear list and a deadline: 7 days to stabilize the situation, then the rest. The first test came before lunch, a message from Paul, half guilty, an audio message with a choked voice and a promise to talk to resolve everything. Marissa soon sent a PDF of a temporary power of attorney to facilitate bill payment and guarantee health. Vivian asked Ruth not to respond and forwarded everything to Grace, who returned a blunt text of refusal. Late in the afternoon, flowers arrived at the apartment without a card, but with the same message: "Sign and we'll be family again." Ruth felt a lump in her throat and blamed herself for still wishing for a fake peace. She didn't sign, and that was the first concrete victory, silent but decisive. The following hours were spent organizing. Named folders, dated screenshots, everything saved in the cloud and on a flash drive. From that point on, feelings became data, memories became proof. On the second day, Grace filed formal requests for protection and to block any change in ownership. She placed an alert in the credit systems and notified the banks about the attempted unauthorized power of attorney. She instructed Ruth to record a short video describing the events, with the date and time, to avoid any inversion of the narrative. They took Ruth to the notary's office to notarize key documents, ensuring their authenticity from the outset. A handwriting expert was on standby in case any very similar signatures emerged. Vivian handled the logistics: groceries, medication, a doctor's appointment, and a dedicated number for authorized calls. Ruth, who had never liked paperwork, began to understand the power of a well-written protocol. It wasn't revenge, it was protection against life being at the mercy of maneuvers. On the fourth day, the first sign of forgery appeared: an email from a distant notary office confirming the signature was in Ruth's name. The alleged signature was in the bottom corner, with the same slant she never used. Grace acted quickly, contacting the notary office, requesting full copies, and identifying the clerk, who recorded the act. The team requested the counter's security camera footage, standard procedure when there is suspicion. Vivian kept Ruth out of the spotlight, ensuring she wouldn't become overwhelmed with unnecessary anxiety. When the digital copy arrived, two familiar faces appeared in the images: Paul and Marissa at the counter. The protocol was immediately challenged, along with the video and the previous history of attempts. The narrative of care became evidence of control. The case took shape with simple logic. Those who call it a burden don't offer selfless protection. Grace consolidated a chronological dossier, from the audio recording at the bus stop to the forgery at the notary's office. She included medical exams to prove that Ruth was oriented and independent in her decisions. She also enclosed the apartment registration and the rental agreement in Ruth's name, proving stable housing. Every screenshot, every note, every receipt formed a straight line against opportunistic versions. Vivian reviewed everything with a sister's attention and a manager's coolness, cutting out excess while keeping the essentials. Ruth asked to reread her own statement and removed words that sounded like excuses. She didn't owe apologies for existing. She owed herself care. When the preliminary hearing was scheduled, Ruth practiced what she needed to say in short, truthful sentences. Grace insisted on rhythm: answer whatever is asked, look at the judge, breathe. Don't justify the unjustifiable. Vivian addressed the things no one sees: comfortable clothes, sturdy shoes, documents organized with colored markers. Ruth set aside an old photograph not to show off, but to remind herself that there was a story before any minutes. She went to bed early, woke with a racing heart, and drank coffee in silence. In the mirror, she didn't see a victim. She saw someone tired but sober in her own direction. She put her briefcase in her bag like someone putting on a seatbelt. She was ready to be heard without begging for attention. At the courthouse, the wait seemed longer than the clock indicated. Like any line that decides fate, Paul and Marissa arrived together, speaking softly, and attempted a greeting that was no longer appropriate. A staff member instructed the parties not to speak outside the courtroom, standard procedure to avoid pressure. Ruth kept her eyes on the electronic board, mentally repeating what mattered: facts, dates, choices. Grace checked the attachments for the third time, unhurriedly, because haste makes mistakes. Vivian squeezed her sister's hand and simply said she was there, which was more than enough. When the case was called, Ruth stood with learned calm, not bravado. She entered the courtroom knowing that life isn't decided with a single sentence, but one sentence can prevent a life from being taken. The judge began the session by asking Ruth to recount, in her own words, what had happened. She spoke slowly, without embellishment, describing the night of her expulsion, the call to Vivian, and the documents she received soon after. She didn't raise her voice, but every detail filled the silence of the courtroom. Paul tried to interrupt, claiming it was a misunderstanding, but the judge restrained him. Ruth remained calm, taking deep breaths between sentences, as Grace had instructed. In the end, the judge took careful notes, and the atmosphere itself seemed to recognize that the woman wasn't lost. She was organized. When it was Paul and Marissa's turn, their narratives diverged from the very first questions. He spoke of concern for his mother's health. She mentioned financial difficulties, and they contradicted each other on deadlines. The judge requested the documents they presented, and presented as supposed authorizations from Ruth. Grace immediately raised an objection, pointing out inconsistencies in the signatures. The expert summoned confirmed within minutes that they were forged. The weight of that realization fell on the couple like a brick, and the courtroom fell into an almost awkward silence. Vivian watched everything with the steady gaze of someone who knew this was the turning point. She discreetly held Ruth's hand, conveying reassurance without words. Ruth, for her part, didn't smile or celebrate. She simply maintained the dignity of someone who had already lived through the worst of it outside, on that stormy night. Now it was just a matter of confirming, before the law, that she would no longer be manipulated. Each piece of evidence presented by the defense dismantled an attempted coup, as if it were a pre-planned and documented sequence. Marissa also tried to claim that the documents had been signed in a state of emotional fragility for Ruth, implying that she was not fully conscious. Grace, prepared, presented recent medical reports attesting to her client's cognitive clarity. The judge made a point of reading aloud. Ruth Ellery is fully capable of managing her life and assets. The official reading sealed a truth Ruth already felt deep down, but which now carried the weight of public recognition. It was more than just a piece of paper. It was the restoration of her autonomy in the eyes of everyone. The hearing stretched on for hours, with arguments ebbing and flowing, but the core of the argument was already established. Ruth didn't need to repeat anything beyond what was necessary. Her simple, firm stance became her greatest proof. The judge concluded the day by announcing that the decision would be released soon, but he also indicated that the attempted forgery would be criminally investigated. Paul lowered his head, Marissa looked at the floor, and for the first time, Ruth felt no guilt, no desire to sugarcoat the situation. It was simply justice taking its natural course. As they left the courthouse, the light rain reminded them of the night it all began. But now the feeling was different. Ruth looked up at the sky and took a deep, unhurried breath. Vivian placed an umbrella over them both and said that this was just a milestone, not the end. Grace gathered the papers in her briefcase and commented that the case was well wrapped up. Ruth listened to them both and thought that, after a long time, she was finally not alone. The storm that had previously driven her out now seemed like a distant backdrop. In the following days, Ruth resumed a simple routine in the apartment. She had coffee early, organized her things, and read the newspapers on the sofa. But something was different. Every decision, no matter how small, came with the knowledge that it was hers. She called the bank, answered messages, scheduled appointments, all calmly, but with the firmness of someone reclaiming her own territory. Vivian came by for visits and long conversations, but left her sister room to breathe alone. Grace maintained daily contact, updating her on legal proceedings. Little by little, Ruth felt like she was in control of her own time again. It was during this period that the idea for the foundation emerged. At first, Ruth casually mentioned to Vivian that she wanted to turn her grief into something useful. Her sister immediately supported her, suggesting they formalize a project. Grace joined the process with legal guidance, explaining how to register a nonprofit. Ruth began outlining clear goals to support elderly women, single mothers, and people who, like her, had been discarded by their own families. The project took shape in scribbled notebooks, then in spreadsheets, and finally in official bylaws. The Ruth Ellery Foundation was launched a few months later in a small ceremony. The room was simple, but filled with people who understood the importance of the initiative. Ruth spoke briefly, in a firm voice, saying that no woman should go through what she had. The audience gave a standing ovation, and for the first time, Ruth felt that her story had become fuel for something greater. It wasn't just about regaining dignity, it was about multiplying it in other lives. That, for her, was more powerful than any court ruling. As the foundation grew, Paul tried new approaches. Long messages, pleas for forgiveness, confusing justifications. Ruth didn't respond. Not because she held a grudge, but because she understood that forgiveness didn't require coexistence. She chose to preserve her peace and channel energy into social work. Vivian, always by her side, reinforced that it wasn't her obligation to reconcile to validate her kindness. Ruth knew this, and with each new day, she felt freer from the burden of needing to be accepted by the son who rejected her. Life took on a new texture. Ruth discovered pleasure in tasks that once seemed automatic. Preparing lunch for friends, walking through the nearby square, listening to loud music without worrying about complaints. Small gestures became symbols of an authentic life. At each meeting at the foundation, she saw in the eyes of the women she served the reflection of her own story. It was no longer just about Ruth. It was about all those who, in silence, carried the pain of being discarded. There, each story resonated, and each tear was accompanied by hope. Late one afternoon, Ruth sat on the balcony of her apartment, now decorated with plants she had chosen herself. The sun was setting slowly, painting the sky with soft hues. She thought of the night it all began, of the wet suitcase and the word that had hurt her. She smiled, not out of irony, but because she recognized the distance between that version of herself and the one she had now. There was pain along the way, but there was also victory. The victory of not having faded, of having reinvented herself and given new meaning to her own existence. In the following months, the repercussions of the court case still haunted Ruth. Some neighbors and acquaintances commented in whispers. Others sent discreet messages of support. She didn't let herself be shaken. She preferred to invest energy in structuring the foundation's programs. She created a group of volunteers to organize visits to nursing homes, bringing attention and guidance on rights. Each encounter was a reminder that her struggle had not been in vain. Ruth became a role model without seeking the spotlight, simply by living consistently with her new truth. Vivian followed everything closely, but made a point of not taking center stage. She always emphasized that the story was Ruth's, and that she was merely offering support. This attitude helped Ruth truly believe she could walk alone. The two had long conversations, often late into the night, about childhood, choices, and regrets. They reconnected like never before, transforming old hurts into learning experiences. Ruth realized that beyond the foundation, she had rebuilt something equally valuable: the bond with her sister who had always been there, even in silence. Grace, for her part, remained attentive to the legal developments. With each update on the case against Paul and Marissa, she calmly explained what it meant and what the next steps would be. Ruth no longer trembled at the mention of her son's name, but she preferred to maintain emotional distance. For her, the courts now represented only a space for justice, not a personal battlefield. This brought serenity. When Grace brought the news that the prosecutor would file criminal charges for forgery, Ruth simply nodded. She didn't celebrate or cry. She simply accepted that the truth was taking its course. The foundation's first tangible results came when it secured free legal aid for 3 elderly women threatened with homelessness. Ruth made a point of closely following each case, listening to their stories and holding hands. At the end of the hearings, all 3 emerged victorious, and the news spread in local newspapers. For the first time, Ruth saw her name associated not with the tragedy of eviction, but with the strength of reconstruction. This brought her a quiet satisfaction, unlike any social recognition she had ever received. Over time, Ruth became accustomed to giving interviews. At first, she was wary of exposing herself, but she realized that her voice could open doors for other women. She spoke simply, without seeking catchphrases, simply sharing what she had experienced. Reporters noted the clarity of her speech and the dignity with which she recounted painful moments. Seeing her story featured in magazines and on TV shows, Ruth no longer saw herself as a celebrity. She saw herself as a living testament to the fact that it is possible to start over, even when rejection comes from where you least expect it. Despite her achievements, there were nights when Ruth found herself remembering the scene of her expulsion. The sound of the rain, the heavy suitcase, the word burden. At those times, she took a deep breath and recalled everything she had achieved since then. She used this memory not to grieve, but to reinforce how far she had come. It was as if that moment had become a fixed point, now used as a benchmark for comparison. Each victory, small or large, stood out precisely because it demonstrated the distance she had traveled since then. The relationship with Paul never resumed. He attempted formal approaches through letters written by the defense, but Grace responded objectively to all of them. Ruth had no interest in reopening wounds. There was no hatred, only the certainty. that she needed to preserve her peace. Over time, she realized that not missing him was already a sign of healing. Absence was no longer a hole, but simply silence. And in that silence, Ruth found rest. On her 73rd birthday, Ruth organized a small celebration at the Foundation's headquarters. Vivian, Grace, volunteers, and some project beneficiaries were there. There was no luxury, but there was laughter and sincere hugs. Ruth blew out the candles on a simple cake and, upon opening her eyes, found herself surrounded by a chorus of voices wishing her a long life. That moment was more meaningful than any grandiose party. It represented that, even after the harshest rejection, she had found a new family. Little by little, Ruth began traveling to learn about similar initiatives in other cities. She visited institutions, exchanged experiences, and returned full of ideas to apply to the foundation. On these trips, she rediscovered the pleasure of feeling useful and curious. She enjoyed sitting by the airplane window and gazing at the sky, thinking about how much life can change in such a short time. For someone who once felt lost, being above the clouds held a silent but powerful symbolism. It was proof that nothing kept her trapped in the past. Vivian was proud of her sister and didn't hide it. She often said that Ruth seemed to have rejuvenated. Her posture was more upright, her smile more frequent, her gaze focused on the future. Ruth, who had previously seen herself as a burden, now saw herself as a foundation for others. This transformed not only her external image, but also her very self-esteem. She recognized within herself the strength that had always existed, but had been stifled by years of blind dedication and lack of recognition. Now, this strength was her banner. As the months passed, Ruth also learned to take better care of herself. She started taking morning walks again, changed her diet, and started attending group yoga classes. She didn't do this out of fashion, but because she wanted her body to keep pace with the vitality of her mind. With each stretch, she felt herself releasing old tensions. This self-care didn't erase the scars, but it gave her new energy to carry on. Ruth finally understood that loving herself wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. One day, when invited to speak at a university about aging and dignity, Ruth felt she had come full circle. She entered the packed auditorium and saw attentive young people waiting to hear. Someone who could be their grandmother. She told her story bluntly, explaining how she nearly lost everything and demonstrating how she rebuilt. At the end, she received a round of warm applause and curious questions. She left with the certainty that her voice had reached not only her generation, but also those that came after. After the talk, Ruth began receiving frequent invitations from social organizations and support groups. At first, she was worried she wouldn't be able to handle it, but she realized that each opportunity offered a chance to broaden the reach of her message. She always repeated that she wasn't an expert on anything other than her own life, and that what she had to offer was truth. This sincerity captivated people. She left the meetings exhausted, but with the feeling that each story touched her, made the struggle even more worthwhile. Despite the intense pace, Ruth maintained discipline to balance her commitments. She set aside exclusive days for rest, reading, and small domestic joys. She enjoyed watering her plants, watching old movies, and preparing recipes that reminded her of her youth. She didn't want her new life to be just about social work. She also wanted to find pleasure in simple things. This balance kept her centered, preventing the foundation from becoming another burden. She learned, for the first time, to respect her own limits without guilt. Vivian insisted that Ruth travel with her occasionally, just for leisure. They went to historic cities, quiet beaches, and small towns with craft fairs. In each place, Ruth observed details with a curious gaze, as if rediscovering the world. These trips also served to strengthen the bond between them. They talked about the past, but much more about the present, and laughed like teenagers in trivial situations. For Ruth, it was almost unbelievable to feel so much lightness after everything. The criminal case against Paul and Marissa moved slowly, as it usually does. Ruth no longer followed it anxiously, leaving that responsibility to Grace. For her, the essential thing was that the truth be documented. Justice's timing was not the same as life's, and she didn't want to live trapped in that. When news arrived, she listened attentively, but soon returned to the Foundation's activities or her personal projects. This attitude showed that she was no longer defined by the conflict, but by how she chose to move forward. At the Foundation, new programs began to be implemented. They created training workshops for women over 60, offering courses in computer science, crafts, and small business management. Ruth closely monitored the events and made a point of talking to each participant. The sparkle in these women's eyes was the fuel that kept her going. She often saw in them the version of herself that had once felt discarded. Now, together, they were building a network of resistance and autonomy. The stories Ruth heard were harsh, but also inspiring. A woman abandoned by her. Children found a new source of income through crafts. Another, a victim of financial violence, was able to recover part of her wealth thanks to the foundation's legal support. Each of their victories added to Ruth's, as if they were all sharing the same journey. This gave the work a meaning that went far beyond statistics or reports. It was a concrete transformation, felt in everyday life. Ruth also learned to better handle public exposure. She no longer felt nervous in front of cameras or microphones. She understood that her image represented something bigger, and this gave her responsibility. She spoke firmly, always emphasizing that aging wasn't synonymous with uselessness. Her words began to be shared on social media, reaching thousands of people. For many, Ruth became a symbol of courage. For her, it was simply the natural consequence of not giving up on herself. Vivian proudly always said that Ruth was writing a new chapter in her own life, not with her pen, but with her actions. Ruth laughed at this observation, but deep down, she recognized the truth. She knew that every step she took now would have an impact beyond her own life. This awareness brought serenity. She no longer sought external approval, nor tried to repair broken relationships. Her focus was clear: to live with dignity and help other women achieve the same. One day, Ruth received a letter from a young woman named Helena, who had read about her story in a magazine. Helena recounted caring for her elderly mother alone while facing rejection from her own family. She said Ruth's journey inspired her not to give up. After finishing the letter, Ruth was moved. She kept the letter in a box where she kept important mementos. For her, that kind of feedback showed that her experience truly made a difference. The foundation began to gain institutional recognition. They received financial support from local businesses and partnerships with universities. This allowed them to expand their programs and hire specialized professionals. Ruth observed everything with gratitude, but also with the care to maintain its essence. She didn't want the foundation to lose focus on individual stories amid its growth. She held frequent team meetings to reinforce the values that gave rise to the project: acceptance, dignity, and justice. Amidst so many achievements, Ruth still sometimes surprised herself with her own energy. At 73, she had more energy than at many earlier stages in her life. The difference was that now that energy was directed towards something meaningful, there was no longer room for feeling like a burden. On the contrary, each day confirmed that her presence in the world had value. This simple yet profound realization was her greatest victory. One Saturday afternoon, while organizing papers in the foundation's office, Ruth stopped for a moment and looked out the window. She saw children playing in the square across the street, heard laughter, and felt the light wind. She thought about how life can change direction unexpectedly. From that stormy night to that sunny moment, there was an abyss of experiences. And yet, she was there, whole. She smiled to herself, with the serenity of someone who knows she needs nothing more than her own peace. The months turned into a period of consolidation. Ruth realized that with each passing day, the foundation was no longer just a project and becoming a solid institution. Her name was mentioned at meetings of social organizations, and invitations to participate in conferences began to arrive. Although she felt flattered, she remained grounded. She never sought titles or honors, and always repeated that her greatest achievement lay in the life stories transformed by collective work. One afternoon, during a computer workshop for seniors, Ruth watched a woman learn to send her first text message. The woman's smile of satisfaction reminded Ruth of receiving support from Vivian and Grace in the first days after her expulsion. The scene moved her because it concretely demonstrated the impact of the opportunity to start over. Ruth understood that she didn't need grand, heroic gestures. She simply had to open doors so others could walk on their own. Vivian remained a pillar, but now in the background. She watched her sister blossom and made a point of not interfering more than necessary. This approach helped Ruth strengthen her independence. Sometimes they laughed together at the irony that, after so long, in opposing roles, they had finally found a balance. Ruth recognized that without Vivian, she wouldn't have taken those first steps, but she also realized that she was now walking alone, confidently. This realization filled her with pride. Amidst so many activities, Ruth set aside time to write personal reflections. These weren't formal diaries, just loose notes in notebooks scattered around the house. She recorded feelings, lessons learned, and small episodes from her daily life. These writings became a form of dialogue with herself, a way to organize her thoughts. Sometimes, when rereading old passages, she realized how much she had changed in such a short time. This exercise helped her appreciate the process of overcoming even more. One day, Grace called her to discuss the possibility of publishing a book about her journey. Ruth was surprised, but hesitant. She was wary of turning her life into a spectacle. Grace explained that it wouldn't be a traditional biography, but rather an inspiring account to help others see themselves in the story. Ruth thought for days before responding. When she accepted, she made it clear that she wanted the focus to be on the process of overcoming, not the suffering. This decision opened an unexpected new chapter. The book was written in partnership with a sensitive journalist who captured Ruth's essence. The process was intense, with long interviews and careful revisions. Ruth was moved by revisiting memories, but also strengthened by realizing the distance she had traveled. When the manuscript was finished, she felt it wasn't just her voice that was there, but that of many women who had gone through similar situations. The launch was simple, but memorable, bringing together foundation supporters and close friends. With the book, Ruth gained even more visibility. She began receiving messages from readers across the country. Many identified with her story and thanked her for her courage in exposing what so many lived in: silence. Ruth read each message carefully, responded whenever she could, and kept some in organized folders. For her, it wasn't about fame, but about creating real connections. Each response showed that her pain had become a channel of hope for others. Despite all the hustle and bustle, Ruth maintained a simple routine at home. She liked to wake up early, make her own coffee, and calmly tidy up the space. These small routines gave her a sense of control and stability. She learned to value these quiet moments as much as the big events. It was in these moments that she reflected on everything she had experienced and prepared herself emotionally for the day's challenges. Simplicity had become a source of strength. Vivian once commented that Ruth looked younger now than she had years ago. She felt it herself, not in her body, which bore the natural marks of age, but in her soul. She was lighter, more open to the future. She no longer carried the shadow of rejection, nor did she see herself as a victim. The past was still there, but it no longer defined her. Ruth felt renewed, as if she had found a new version of herself that had always been hidden, waiting for the chance to emerge. In the Foundation's work, Ruth began to identify leaders among the beneficiaries themselves. She encouraged these women to take on coordination and decision-making roles. She believed that transformation should not depend on a single figure, but should be shared. This movement further strengthened the institution and created a collective spirit. Seeing other women taking on leadership roles was one of Ruth's greatest rewards. It showed that the legacy would not be limited to her, but would continue to multiply. Over time, Ruth began to be invited to serve on the boards of national organizations focused on dignified aging. She accepted some invitations, declined others, always choosing what truly made sense. She didn't want to get bogged down in purposeless formal commitments. Her priority remained the foundation and the people who depended on it. This clarity of focus prevented burnout and kept her true to her values. Ruth knew she didn't need to be everywhere to make a difference. One winter night, as she closed the foundation after a meeting, Ruth walked down the street lit by old streetlights. The cold was biting, but she felt warm inside. She remembered being thrown out in the rain, carrying a suitcase and the weight of rejection. Now, she walked with her head held high, with solid projects and a support network built on trust. She smiled to herself, understanding that there was no greater victory than this sense of belonging in her own life. With the book circulating, Ruth was invited to major television programs. The idea of speaking to millions of people frightened her at first, but Grace and Vivian encouraged her. In the studio, sitting in front of the cameras, Ruth spoke with the same simplicity as always. She recounted how she was thrown out of her home, how she found support, and how she rebuilt her life. The audience was moved, and she received messages from strangers thanking her for putting into words pain that many hid. This showed Ruth that her story no longer belonged to her alone. The impact brought new partnership opportunities for the foundation. Companies offered support, and universities wanted to develop joint projects. Ruth cautiously analyzed each proposal with the help of Grace and Vivian. She didn't want the cause to be used as empty marketing. She made a point of ensuring that each partnership had a real impact on the women served. This care preserved the foundation's credibility and reinforced that the work was not about visibility, but about concrete transformation. During this time, Ruth began receiving invitations to speak at high schools. She spoke to teenagers about respect for elders, family responsibility, and dignity. Many young people approached her later to share stories of conflict at home. Some confessed shame about how they treated their parents or grandparents. Ruth listened without judgment, offering simple but firm words. She felt that planting seeds in young people was as important as supporting women who had already suffered. It was a way to prevent future stories of abandonment. Meanwhile, the legal case against Paul and Marissa continued. New evidence emerged, reinforcing the accusations of forgery and attempted fraud. Ruth no longer took direct involvement. She left everything in Grace's hands. When she received news, she maintained a calm demeanor. She no longer expected revenge, but she believed in justice as a principle. For her, the most important thing was to have shown, in court and in life, that she would not be erased. Victory had already come the moment she refused to sign any paperwork. One morning, Ruth received an unexpected visitor, one of her neighbors from when she lived with Paul. The woman confessed she felt guilty for not helping that stormy night. She said she saw Ruth on the sidewalk, but was afraid to get involved. Ruth listened silently, and finally replied simply that she understood. She held no resentment. The neighbor cried, apologizing, and Ruth hugged her. This simple gesture showed her how much she had matured. She didn't need apologies to move on, but accepting them brought her lightness. At the foundation, Ruth decided to create a specific program called Second Chance, aimed at elderly women who had been rejected by their families. The project offered temporary housing, psychological support, and legal guidance. The idea stemmed from the memory of the night she became homeless. She wanted no other woman to experience the same thing. The program gained rapid acceptance, and soon there were already waiting lists. This reinforced Ruth's conviction that her pain had been transformed into purpose. With so much work, Ruth became a respected public figure, but she maintained her simple essence. She enjoyed going to the grocery store alone, talking to strangers, and walking around the neighborhood without security guards or other paraphernalia. This normalcy kept her connected to what truly mattered. Some people recognized her and asked for photos, and she humbly accepted, but she didn't let it distract her from her routine. For Ruth, the greatest impact came from real, face-to-face encounters, not from the headlines. Vivian watched this transformation with quiet pride. In private conversations, she said she had never imagined seeing Ruth so confident. She remembered her sister who cried in secret, who accepted humiliation in silence, and compared it to the woman who now led meetings and inspired crowds. Ruth listened fondly, but always remembered that none of this would have happened without Vivian's first act of redemption. This recognition maintained a bond of gratitude between them that no storm could break. On one occasion, Ruth was invited to receive a tribute from the city hall for her social work. At the event, alongside other community leaders, she took the stage to give thanks. She said she didn't see herself as a heroine, but as a survivor who transformed pain into action. The audience gave a standing ovation, and Ruth, looking at the people, felt a different warmth. It wasn't vanity, it was the feeling that she had found her place in the world. That was worth more than any formal award. Even with so many achievements, there were nights when Ruth still dreamed of Paul. Sometimes, he appeared young, sometimes adult, but always distant. She woke with a heavy heart, took a deep breath, and remembered that she had done everything she could. She harbored no hope of reconciliation, but she acknowledged that the longing existed. She learned to live with it without letting it dominate her. It was a scar that wouldn't disappear, but it also didn't define who she was. This acceptance was part of her maturity. Every birthday, Ruth made a point of celebrating, not by the number, but by the meaning. Each new year was a victory over the night she was rejected. At 74, she organized a meeting at the foundation with women served by the Second Chance program. It was a simple celebration, but charged with emotion. As she blew out the candles, she gave thanks for being alive and clear-headed to continue contributing. She said out loud that she had never felt as fulfilled as she did now. The applause and hugs she received were the most precious gift. One late afternoon, as she walked through the foundation's nearly empty headquarters, Ruth stopped in front of a photo wall. They depicted women smiling, participating in workshops, and holding court victory documents. She lightly touched one of the photos and was moved. This was the tangible legacy she was leaving behind. She thought to herself that, even if the future was uncertain, nothing would erase what had already been built. She smiled serenely, knowing that her story did not end in rejection, but in rebirth. The Foundation's growth brought new administrative challenges. With more resources and more people involved, it was necessary to professionalize management. Ruth had no experience in this area, but she recognized the importance of delegating. She hired a coordinator with a technical background to handle finances and logistics. This allowed her to continue dedicating herself to human contact, which was what truly made the difference. This decision demonstrated maturity, understanding that leadership also means trusting others. Amid these changes, Ruth received an invitation to speak at an international conference on aging and human rights. The idea of traveling abroad made her apprehensive, but also excited. With the support of Vivian and Grace, she decided to accept. She prepared her presentation simply, sharing her own experience as a starting point. At the conference, before a diverse audience, she spoke about dignity, autonomy, and resilience. She received a standing ovation, and in that moment, she felt her voice had crossed borders. Upon returning home, Ruth reflected on how far she had come since the night of the storm. The journey showed that her story could inspire people from different cultures. It reinforced the idea that human feelings, abandonment, pain, resilience, are universal. Regardless of language or age, everyone understood what it means to be rejected and then find the strength to start over. This realization gave Ruth even more confidence to continue her mission with the Foundation. In her daily practice, Ruth remained close to the women she served. She enjoyed listening to individual stories, asking details about their lives, and remembering names and faces. This care made each woman feel valued. For Ruth, there was nothing more important than being truly seen, after so long being invisible. She knew from experience the impact this has. Therefore, she insisted that the Foundation be a space where each woman was recognized as a person, not a number. Vivian noticed that Ruth, even when busy, never failed to cultivate small self-care routines. Morning walks, casual get-togethers with friends, reading time. This balance kept her grounded. Ruth knew she couldn't dedicate all her energy solely to social work, or she would lose herself again. This time, she wouldn't give up on herself. This awareness was the fruit of everything she'd experienced, learning to put herself first without feeling selfish. The criminal case against Paul and Marissa finally reached the trial stage. Ruth was called to testify again, but this time she didn't feel the same pressure as before. She entered the courtroom calmly, knowing she didn't have to prove anything but the truth. She listened attentively to the arguments, answered clearly, and let the lawyers handle the rest. When the sentence was handed down, confirming the forgery and paving the way for harsher punishments, Ruth simply took a deep breath. She didn't cheer, she didn't celebrate. She simply felt that justice had been served. Paul tried to look at his mother during the hearing, but Ruth didn't look back. There was no anger, just a decision to no longer carry that burden. Marissa, visibly dejected, left the room without a word. Ruth returned home accompanied by Vivian and Grace, in silence. What needed to be said had been resolved. For the first time, she realized she no longer needed to think about that matter. The cycle had closed. This brought a sense of freedom she had never experienced before. In the following days, Ruth continued her normal routine. She didn't comment on the outcome of the process unless asked. She didn't want her identity to be trapped in the past. She preferred to talk about the Foundation, the projects, and her new achievements. This conscious choice was part of her overcoming, not letting rejection define her life. Now, those who knew her saw Ruth not as the victim of a sad story, but as the protagonist of a remarkable transformation. A major milestone was when the Foundation opened a new, larger, and better-equipped headquarters. The space featured service rooms, a library, and common areas. On the day of the inauguration, Ruth walked the hallways with emotion. She remembered how it all began in a makeshift apartment and compared it to that structure. The feeling was one of collective victory. Each wall erected represented the struggle of many women. As she cut the symbolic ribbon, Ruth felt she was leaving a concrete legacy for the future. The media covered the event, but Ruth wasn't overwhelmed by the exposure. In interviews, she consistently emphasized that the Foundation was the result of collaborative effort. She cited Vivian's support, Grace's expertise, and the volunteers' dedication. She made a point of sharing the credit. This attitude further increased everyone's respect for her. She didn't present herself as a savior, but as part of a network. This humility became one of her most recognizable traits. Despite her busy schedule, Ruth reserved time for moments of introspection. She liked to sit on her porch at dusk and watch the street scene. At these times, she recalled her entire journey. Sometimes she cried, sometimes she smiled, but she always concluded that it had been worth the struggle. Every pain she endured transformed into something greater. This exercise in memory didn't keep her trapped in the past, but rather reminded her that it was possible to be reborn even after a brutal fall. On one of these sunsets, Ruth wrote in her notebook a sentence that summed up her journey. "I was thrown out of a house, but I found a home within myself." When she finished writing, she closed the notebook and smiled. She didn't need anyone to read it. It was enough for her. It was the synthesis of everything she had experienced. Proof that, even when the world seems to be falling apart, it is still possible to build new paths. This thought would remain with her forever as her greatest achievement. The new phase also brought official recognition. Ruth was nominated for National Social Impact Awards, competing with projects from various fields. When she received the news that she would be honored, she remained silent for a few seconds. She didn't see herself as someone who sought trophies, but she understood that this recognition could open even more doors for the foundation. On the day of the ceremony, she took the stage with the same serenity as always, thanked everyone, and emphasized that the merit was collective. She received a standing ovation, and she felt she was in the right place. With her increased visibility, invitations for international interviews began to pour in. Ruth learned to work with translators and adapted her approach to diverse audiences. She always spoke authentically, without trying to sound like someone she wasn't. This sincerity transcended cultural barriers. People from other countries identified with her story and sent messages of support. Ruth realized with surprise that her journey, born on a night of pain, now resonated in distant places she never imagined she'd visit. Amidst so many activities, Ruth continued to take care of the practical details of life. She went to the doctor regularly, kept up with her checkups, and followed health guidelines. She didn't neglect her body, wanting it to keep pace with the vitality of her mind. She walked, stretched, and maintained a balanced routine. This simple care had become part of her new philosophy. It wasn't enough to survive. It was necessary to live a quality life. This gave her the confidence to remain active and present in all her projects. With each visit to the foundation, Ruth was captivated by the stories that emerged. She met women who had rebuilt their businesses, returned to school, and regained their self-esteem. These transformations were, for her, proof that it was all worth it. Often, upon hearing stories, Ruth would quietly hold back tears. She wept not out of sadness, but out of recognition. She knew exactly what it meant to go through the pain of abandonment. Therefore, each victory for another woman was also her own. Vivian followed alongside, but now with the calm of someone watching her sister soar on her own. She was proud of each achievement, but let Ruth shine on her own. At family gatherings, she would comment on her sister's work with distant relatives, always highlighting her courage. Ruth smiled, but remembered to be grateful. She never forgot that it was Vivian who reached out when all seemed lost. This bond remained like an invisible foundation, supporting every step. Grace had also become more than just a lawyer. She was now a close friend, someone she trusted completely. The three formed a kind of triad: Vivian, the emotional support; Grace, the legal protection; and Ruth, the strength of lived experience. This combination made everything more solid. They often gathered just for dinner and conversation, without discussing lawsuits or the foundation. On these occasions, Ruth felt she had found a new family, built not by blood ties, but by affinity and loyalty. The case against Paul and Marissa continued to unfold, but Ruth didn't let it occupy her heart. The penalties imposed were the responsibility of the courts. She didn't wish them ill, she simply didn't want any more contact. This stance surprised some, who expected resentment, but Ruth had learned that harboring hatred would give the past a power it didn't deserve. Silence was her form of liberation. The future, for her, lay elsewhere, and that was where she was headed. The foundation won a Social Innovation Award thanks to its Segunda Chance program. This recognition brought additional resources, allowing it to open new temporary housing vacancies. Ruth closely monitored every detail of the project, from the selection of beneficiaries to the activities offered. She made a point of talking to everyone and listening to their stories. For her, they weren't numbers and reports. They were people with unique trajectories. This direct contact maintained the essence of the work and reinforced its real impact. One Sunday morning, Ruth was invited to speak at a local church. Although she wasn't religiously affiliated, she accepted out of respect for the community. She told her story to attentive congregants, emphasizing the importance of compassion and solidarity. At the end, many people approached to thank her. Ruth realized that her message transcended all boundaries. It was about humanity. This experience left a deep impression on her, reinforcing the universality of her legacy. At 75, Ruth celebrated every small gesture of daily life: a lunch with friends, a leisurely walk, the pleasure of choosing flowers at the market. These simple things became great symbols of her freedom. She no longer depended on anyone's approval to feel alive. This sense of autonomy was perhaps her most important achievement. After a lifetime dedicated to others, she finally allowed herself to be the protagonist of her own existence. Over time, Ruth began to be invited to teach university extension courses on aging and social rights. She prepared her classes with dedication, but kept her language simple. She knew her strength lay in real experience, not theories. Students listened attentively, asked questions, and left inspired. Ruth realized she was planting seeds in new generations. She was certain that her story would not end with her, but would continue to resonate. At a foundation meeting, Ruth was surprised by a tribute organized by the women she helped. They created a mural with photos, letters, and testimonials of gratitude. When Ruth entered the room and saw it, she was moved. She hugged each of them, repeating that the merit was collective. But deep down, she knew that her courage had paved the way for everyone. At that moment, she felt a wave of peace wash over her. It was confirmation that she had transformed pain into a legacy. With the foundation fully operational, Ruth began to consider ways to ensure the project would continue even after her departure. She spoke with Vivian and Grace about creating a permanent board made up of trusted women and former beneficiaries who had already become leaders. The idea was for the foundation to continue regardless of her presence. This decision demonstrated Ruth's vision for the future. She didn't want everything to depend solely on her, but rather to become a self-sustaining network. When announcing the council's creation, Ruth saw tears in the eyes of many women. They understood they were being called not only to receive help, but to take on responsibilities and leadership. This trust placed in them was part of Ruth's philosophy. Restoring dignity also meant handing over power. It was a symbolic moment, as if passing on a lit torch. The burden of leadership was no longer exclusive but shared. Meanwhile, Ruth's personal life remained peaceful. She continued living in the apartment she had lovingly decorated, surrounded by plants and meaningful memories. She enjoyed receiving visitors, but also valued the silence. Sometimes she would sit alone listening to old music and letting her mind wander. At these times, she thought about the past, but not with pain. She looked back with the serenity of someone who had transformed scars into learning experiences. There was no longer any weight, only memories integrated into her story. Vivian used to say that Ruth now had a sparkle in her eyes that she hadn't had before. It was as if, even at her advanced age, she had discovered a new youth. Ruth laughed, but recognized there was some truth in it. The freedom she had gained made her lighter, more open to the world. She no longer worried about pleasing or proving anything to anyone. This change in attitude was reflected in everything, in the way she dressed, spoke, and even walked. She was a fulfilled woman, in the Aika, truest sense of the word. A major milestone was when Ruth was invited to light the symbolic flame at a national event on seniors' rights. On stage, in front of thousands of people, she raised the torch with both hands and received a warm round of applause. The scene was broadcast live and featured in newspapers. For Ruth, that gesture represented more than a ritual. It was the embodiment of everything she had achieved. The woman who had once been thrown out of her home was now a symbol of resistance. Despite public recognition, Ruth didn't let herself be dazzled. She returned home with the same simple manner, preparing her tea and organizing the next day. She didn't seek to live by appearances, because she knew that the essence of her work lay in the small daily encounters. It was in these moments of closeness with the women she served that she found her greatest fulfillment. This humility made her even more admired, as it demonstrated that her strength came not from fame, but from the truth of her story. One autumn evening, Ruth received an unexpected phone call. It was from a former neighbor of Paul's who wanted to inform her of his whereabouts. He said that Paul and Marissa were facing financial and social difficulties, isolated after the lawsuits. Ruth listened in silence, thanked him for the information, and hung up. She felt neither pleasure nor sadness, only a calm detachment. She understood that their fate was no longer her responsibility. This neutrality was the final proof that she had freed herself from that wound. On her 76th birthday, Ruth organized a large gathering at the foundation. Volunteers, beneficiaries, and supporters were in attendance. It was a simple yet intense celebration. During her speech, Ruth said that age wasn't a burden, but an achievement. Each year represented resilience and learning. At the end, she received flowers, hugs, and lingering applause. She left with the certainty that she had transformed her journey into something much greater than herself. Grace, moved, commented after the party that Ruth had become a national figure. But Ruth simply smiled and said, "I'm just someone who didn't give up on life." That phrase summed it all up. It wasn't about grandeur, but about persistence. This simplicity was what made her story resonate with so many. She didn't need elaborate speeches to inspire. She simply showed, with her own life, that it's possible to rise again even after the most painful rejection. Time passed. Ruth began receiving invitations to write articles for newspapers and magazines. She accepted some, always maintaining her authentic voice. She wrote about aging, dignity, and solidarity. She didn't seek complex terms, preferring to speak clearly. Her texts were well received and shared widely. This brought her joy, because she knew her words could reach people who would never otherwise attend a lecture or visit a foundation. It was another channel for spreading hope. Vivian was always present at every important moment. The two traveled together whenever possible, and each trip was an opportunity to celebrate life. On these getaways, they talked about everything, laughed about old memories, and dreamed of new projects. Ruth deeply valued this partnership. Her sister wasn't just company. She was an essential part of her story of overcoming adversity. Without Vivian, nothing would have begun. And now, together, they celebrated each achievement as if it were shared. On a quiet afternoon, Ruth was walking through the garden of the foundation's new headquarters when a young beneficiary approached and said, "You changed my life." Ruth smiled, touched her shoulder, and replied, "You were the one who decided to change. I just showed her it was possible." This simple exchange reflected exactly what Ruth believed. She didn't want to be seen as a savior, but as an inspiration. Each woman she helped was the protagonist of her own story. And that, for Ruth, was the greatest victory. As the foundation matured and the recognition it gained, Ruth began to reflect more on legacy. She didn't think about material possessions, but about examples. She wanted her story to be remembered not for the abandonment she suffered, but for the way she transformed that pain into action. She talked about this with Vivian and Grace, and they always reinforced that this legacy was already secure. Ruth, however, liked to keep her feet on the ground, reminding herself every day that everything could have been different if she had given up on that stormy night. While visiting one of the Segunda Chance shelters, Ruth was greeted by women who now had a safe roof over their heads and ongoing life projects. One of them, in tears, said that if it weren't for the foundation, she would be living on the streets. Ruth hugged the woman tightly, feeling the weight and strength of gratitude in her body. This encounter left a deep impression on her. It was living proof that her initial rejection had become a haven for so many others. At the end of that day, when she got home, Ruth looked in the mirror and recognized herself, not just as a survivor, but as someone who chose to be the protagonist of her own life. The marks on her face didn't bother her. They were testaments to her resilience. For the first time in decades, she felt pride not in what she had done for others, but in what she had done for herself. This realization brought a new peace, one that didn't depend on applause or external recognition. Vivian observed this transformation closely and often commented that Ruth had become an inspiration not only to strangers, but also to her own family. Some distant relatives, previously absent, began to seek her out, asking for advice or offering support. Ruth welcomed them cordially, but without illusions. She learned to filter relationships, choosing to keep close only those who truly contributed something positive. This discernment was an essential part of her new phase. Grace once asked Ruth if she still thought about Paul. There was silence for a few seconds before Ruth replied, "I do, but not like before. It doesn't hurt anymore. It's just a memory." This answer showed that the wound had healed. It didn't mean forgetting, but rather the release of the burden. Ruth knew she couldn't control other people's choices, only her own, and she decided to move forward with ease. This clarity was one of the most important victories of her life. At 77, Ruth organized a major foundation conference, bringing together experts, volunteers, and beneficiaries. The event featured lectures, discussion groups, and cultural performances. In her opening speech, Ruth spoke with the same firmness as always, emphasizing that aging is not synonymous with uselessness. She said that each person has value until their last day. Her words echoed throughout the auditorium, generating long and emotional applause. It was one of the most memorable moments of her career. During the conference, Ruth received a surprise tribute. A video was shown with testimonials from dozens of women who had been impacted by the foundation. Some spoke about regaining their self-esteem, others about being able to resume their professional lives. Ruth watched emotionally, discreetly wiping away tears. At the end, she stood up and thanked everyone, saying that none of it would have been possible without the support network she had built alongside so many women. The audience responded with a chorus of warm applause. In the days following the conference, Ruth felt renewed energy. She no longer saw herself simply as the founder of the institution, but as part of a larger movement. She realized that her life was intertwined with that of so many others. This awareness made her wake up each day with purpose. There was no longer room for feeling invisible. Every gesture, every word, every choice confirmed her worth. This certainty was the foundation of her inner peace. One night, sitting on the porch, Ruth reread her old notebooks. She found notes from a time when she felt lost, short sentences filled with pain. She compared them with her current reflections, more serene and confident. She realized she had come a long way, even without leaving the same body. This contrast made her smile. She kept the notebooks with care, knowing they were silent witnesses to her transformation. It was as if she carried two versions of herself there, the wounded and the healed. Vivian and Grace together organized an intimate dinner to celebrate Ruth's journey. At the gathering, they toasted not only her achievements, but also life itself. Ruth looked at them both and said, "If it weren't for you, I might not be here today." Vivian replied, "Yes, you would be. You just needed to remember the strength you always had." This exchange moved everyone. It was the epitome of the relationship they had built: support, trust, and truth. There was no debt, only mutual gratitude. The next morning, Ruth walked to the foundation's headquarters alone, without telling anyone. She wanted to observe the place in silence. She entered the rooms, looked at the photos on the walls, and felt the vibrant energy of the space. She sat for a few minutes in the inner courtyard and took a deep breath. This wasn't just a building, it was the embodiment of her overcoming. She left with the conviction that, regardless of the future, she had already accomplished her mission. Her life had meaning and impact. Late that same afternoon, as the sun set, Ruth wrote in her notebook, "Today I know I am not a burden. I am a root, I am shelter, I am strength." She closed the notebook slowly and smiled. The woman who had been driven away during a storm was now a symbol of resilience and dignity. There was no erasing this transformation. The cycle was complete. From pain came purpose, and from abandonment came legacy. Ruth not only survived, she overcame.